Have you ever heard a concept album that was so good it blew your mind? I certainly have. However, what actually makes a concept album good? Establishing a good concept. I know this seems like common sense. However, it is important to ascertain a coherent story or at least specific themes or atmosphere before you make a concept album. It doesn't have to be crazy either. Slide by George Clanton's concept is going down a slide as a metaphor for a breakup. And it's fucking awesome! He has even admitted to making the lyrics intentionally vague. Paraphrasing. Living Loose isn't a song that has a lot of meaning. I'm trying to use the words to evoke an emotion in the same way I think My Bloody Valentine does. I want to keep the lyrics vague enough for people to directly relate to. I don't think that a good concept album has to have a tangible narrative either. Rough ideas or atmospheres can get you really far if you know what you're doing. Interpose Turn on the Bright Lights, for example, is built around the alienation of living in New York City and the melancholy in New York post 9/11. And they nailed it! I've not heard another album that scratches that same gloomy itch that Turn on the Bright Lights manages to do so well. Every song on the album sounds like it's longing for something that has long passed and carries this sense of loneliness throughout. I think it is also important for artists to be invested in their concept and live with them. Childish Gambino, who is the ambitious concept guy, had built a workspace during the making of Because the Internet called The Temple. A mansion where he recorded the accompanying short film for it, Clapping for the Wrong Reasons. He immersed himself in the character and the world he was building through the sets he made and through this mansion. Speaking of George Clanton from earlier, he had also said something regarding setting the mood for creation in jest. In an Instagram post he made from the behind-the-scenes filming of Slide's album cover, he says that while making the album, he would go down this slide every day 1,000 times to make sure I was in a fun mood. Knowing your concept holistically, whether your concept album is bound by a linear story, an event, or a rough time, think about the different perspectives on what you're exploring with it. Like viewing concept albums the same way I would a story. Imagine if you were writing a story about somebody struggling with alcohol addiction, but there was no plot or backstory past they drink and do crazy things. Would be really shitty, right? Same thing applies for concept albums. Here's a formula I made up. You get your idea, you break it down into different emotions or subtopics, and you think about those topics and expand on them. An example of a looser concept album which does a great job of exploring different perspectives on the same issue is Atrocity Exhibition by Danny Brown. It doesn't have a linear story, however the album is clearly themed around Danny Brown's struggle with addiction, seeing him with his highs and lows. The opening track, Downward Spiral and Hell for It, acts as this permanent hell loop where Danny Brown starts at his lowest point, hallucinating voices and being stuck in the depths of his addiction, and after Hell for It, he loops back into that same cycle. Atrocity Exhibition will be nowhere near as good of an album if every single song was just, I got high and I did drugs and I'm being crazy. No, for being an album that's just around his addiction, it is far from a one-note album. Showing versus telling. Music is another form of storytelling. I'm sure you've seen the writing advice of showing, not telling. This can also be applied to concept albums. My favorite concept albums are the ones that slowly immerse you in the world they're building and give you little pieces to piece together, rather than trying to dump all the information about the concept all at once. Visions of Bodies Being Burned by Clipping is a great example of that. Clipping are generally good at concept albums, but this has to be my favorite album of theirs. Each song, even by itself, feels like woozy horror movie scenes. For example, the song Check the Lock shows the paranoia of a drug seller constantly checking their locks and being locked in that state of paranoia because they are so worried that the cops are going to catch them. The ambient interludes in between, such as Drove and Inauguration, further aid this. If you have to tell people that your album is a concept album for them to understand that it is a concept album, you need to go back to the drawing board. The Death of Slim Shady comes to mind. There's already been a lot of vigorous critique for it, but this public service announcement that it's a concept album is probably one of the most embarrassing things about it. It is likely that many people seemingly glossed over the concept of this album due to it barely committing to the concept and also not having any cohesion, which brings me onto cohesion. Is the narrative or mood of the album consistent? Does the album concept fall apart as it progresses? For example, Vanisher Horizon Scraper slightly grew off of me for this reason. The music is great, sure, but I think the story falls apart after the 10th track, Natural Causes. You have a very slow burn, melancholic atmosphere, depicting a sailor on a personal voyage, with little major plot points, and then suddenly in 4 tracks, a major storm has stirred, a moon-eating dragon emerges from the water, and he subsequently drowns. What? This doesn't just apply to narrative-driven concept albums though. Denzel Curry's Taboo has a pretty straightforward concept. It has 3 sides, light, grey, and dark. As the album progresses, it sonically gets more moody and aggressive. A concept like that could easily fall apart if the track listing was worse. Imagine if Black Balloons, one of the most calm and poppy songs on the album, was near the end, or if the shifts in tone were too jarring. These are some general things I've noticed that good concept albums follow. However, here are some extra things I've seen discourse on concept albums point out. Some concept albums I like do not follow these pointers, but they are interesting to think about when discussing what makes a good concept album. Does the album require additional context to understand the concept fully? Now, I'll say this. I think that some concepts can only be understood through supplementary content. This can be a valid critique, but I think as long as you can grasp a coherent theme or loose story from the album without extra tidbits, then it is alright to rely on external content. For example, Everywhere at Any Time often gets a lot of bad faith critique about relying too much on external narratives about the music being about dementia. However, I think that even if you listen to it without that context, it still proves as an interesting look at a slow degradation of one's mental state. Is the album replayable? Replayability and the discourse around it can be really silly at times, such as people who say things like, "This is my favorite album, but I never listened to it." But it is still interesting to think about. Good concept albums should provide you with extra details to pick out and discover the more you listen to it, or provide a specific atmosphere or mood that you often want to return to. However, there are some albums which I believe are great concept albums which have low replayability. For example, the album Superflat by Coinlocker Kid often gets ragged on for dragging on too long and being too weird, but that weirdness fits the themes of mental decline. Not to mention that quite a few people that rag on the album for not being replayable, especially because it doesn't have a lot of actual tracks, are completely ignoring the fact that it is under the radio drama genre, which is not a fault of the album itself, it's just the genre it's in. Is the concept too complicated? It can be argued that it is best to balance the depth of the concept with replayability. It can also be said that people may even ignore the concept if it seems too convoluted. The discussion around To Pimp A Butterfly and Mr. Soul for Joker's Wave comes to mind. However, I think this line of thinking behind this comes from the faulty assumption that each listen of a concept album has to be about unpacking and dissecting and analyzing the meanings and subliminal messages behind the music. Going back to my previous point about replayability, this is why I see people often saying things like, "To Pimp A Butterfly is Kendrick's best, but I prefer Damn." I don't think it is the fault of the artist for having a complicated concept. Sometimes artists may be overambitious and the albums they make might not quite make the landing, but this is often the result of other factors I mentioned earlier, such as cohesion or even a not properly thought out concept. There are a lot of variables going into what makes a concept album good, but overall, the efficacy of showing a theme or message is the driving factor behind a good concept album. Even the most simple concepts can make great concept albums. I would love to hear a concept album about paint drying. What are your favorite concept albums? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, press a like. If you disliked it, press a dislike and let me know what you disliked about it in the comments below. As always, I'm Gabs and have a nice day.